Contrary to popular belief, red meat and butter, as well as cholesterol from eggs, are not driving the high prevalence of cardiovascular disease. A new 27-year follow-up study finds that consumption of ultra-processed foods, these are baked goods, these are sugar-sweetened beverages, candy bars, ice cream, crackers, chips, pretzels, sugar-sweetened beverages, as well as fried foods, are the drivers behind the high prevalence of coronary artery disease. The 27-year follow-up study finds a linear association between the amount of ultra-processed food consumption and risk of future coronary artery disease. So this is really important for people who are trying to prevent heart disease. We know that...
No. Honestly, this one quite confuses me because he uses a study talking about ultra-processed food and its association between cardiovascular disease to make the point, or the case I should say, that red meat, butter and eggs are not associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Just because you consume a lot of ultra-processed foods doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the only thing that will increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. So I'm a little bit confused here. But why not just look at the data regarding these three food items and their effects on our health? And I would primarily like to focus on unprocessed meat here, because unprocessed meat gets seen on social media as a superfood. Buckle up your seatbelt because it's going to get a little bit sciencey. The following study wanted to see how much of an effect red meat, poultry or fish do have on cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. They included 30,000 participants and they had a total follow-up of around 30 years. And the results were that they had a 2% absolute increased risk for cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. And it's important to know that the results are based on 2 servings per week. 1 serving of unprocessed red meat is defined in this study as 4 Oz, and that is around 110-115 grams of meat. So that basically means that the 2% absolute risk has been shown by consuming around 230 grams, 220 grams of unprocessed red meat per week, which is not a lot because the average person consumes 150 grams of red meat per day. Let's move on to the next study. This prospective cohort study included more than 148,000 participants, which were free of cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease at baseline, meaning at the start of the study. They saw that replacing 0.5 servings of red meat with nuts, whole grains, and skimmed milk was associated with a 14, 7, and 4% risk reduction for cardiovascular disease. And in case you're wondering, well, did they adjust for socioeconomic status, for BMI, for physical activities, and so on and so forth? Yes, they did. No, I won't go through all the things that they adjusted for, but I guess you can see that the researchers did their job greatly. Let's move on to the next study because we are just getting warmed up here. This study, called The Major Dietary Protein Sources and Risk of Coronary Heart Disease in Women, followed more than 84,000 women aged 30 to 15 years old in the Nurses' Health Study. They also had no known cancer, diabetes, angina, myocardial infarction, stroke, or other cardiovascular diseases at the start of the study. They had a median follow-up of 26 years. And they saw a 30% risk reduction if you replaced 1 serving of red meat with 1 serving of nuts. And you also had around a 13% decrease if you replaced red meat with low-fat dairy, poultry, and fish. So far, we just looked at prospective cohort studies. Prospective means that during these observational types of studies, researchers are following up on people. And that is a very important detail. If you assess everything at baseline and you don't follow up on people, what they're doing, or what they're changing, I should say, within their life, a lot of things will change within the next 1, 2, let alone decades of years later. Maybe their socioeconomic status will change. Maybe their physical activity levels will change. maybe their diet will change. Because ask yourself the following question: what did change in your life the last 3, 4, 5 years? I guess quite a lot. Let's have a look at the systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies. Researchers wanted to see what happens on your cardiometabolic health and all-cause mortality if you substitute animal proteins for plant proteins. And without looking at the results, let's look at something that you can visually see with your own eyes. And this is the forest plot. What you can see on the top is if you replace total red meat with nuts and legumes and whole grains, you will get a decreased risk. The decreased risk actually is even stronger for processed meats, of course, but it remains just significantly for unprocessed red meat as well. And the same thing goes for poultry, and a more significant decreased risk was seen for eggs. And if you replace butter with margarine, we see a slight increased risk, but it's not statistically significant. And we had a small decreased risk for olive oil. Let's have a look at another substitution study and see what happens if you replace red meat with other plant foods and the risk for colorectal cancer. They included more than 43,000 participants, and it's important to note that they modeled the partial substitution analysis at around 100 grams of red meat and 50 grams of processed meat per week. Meaning they wanted to see, for example, what happens if people ate 100 grams of red meat, which is actually not a lot. But regardless of not being a lot, what they saw during the median follow-up time of almost 29 years, that if you replace red meat, for example, with vegetables and fruits or whole grains, or both combined, you had a decreased risk regardless. These results are again done on a population which eats a high meat diet. Just if you replace a small amount of red meat with some vegetables or fruits, you can already start to see a small reduction in the risk. And I know what some people might be thinking, well, this was just observational data. What about the randomized controlled trials? And we have to think about one thing that is very key here. If you want to see if a food item, for example, is associated with an increased risk for cancer or cardiovascular disease, for example, you have to follow these people for decades. Because fortunately for us, these diseases don't develop overnight. It takes decades, multiple decades for them to manifest. But I want to drive our attention on a Cochrane review that has been published this year. What they did in this review was that they actually had a look at the results of observational data and randomized controlled trial. And what they wanted to see was how similar were the results or how far apart were the results between observational data and randomized controlled trials. I will now blend in a forest plot. Feel free to do a screenshot or just look up the study yourself to kind of like zoom in. But I feel like you don't have to be a scientist to see that the dots align. These dots are basically looking at the health outcome data from observational studies and randomized controlled trials. And out of the 2,800 randomized controlled trials involving more than 3.8 million participants and more than 3,900 observational studies involving almost 19.5 million participants, and to paraphrase the researchers, they saw no to very small differences between the effect estimates of randomized controlled trials and observational studies. And by the way, I've not touched butter or eggs, but these food items raise LDL cholesterol. And one thing that many people that are actually opting for butter or eggs or red meat consumption fail to kind of like highlight is the following: Mendelian randomization. Mendelian randomization is basically nature's randomized controlled trial, because they take, for example, people that have high LDL levels at birth and they observe them. Meaning, doesn't matter if they start smoking, if they have a healthy diet, if they don't do any physical activities at all, if they get abducted by aliens, or so on and so forth. Their LDL levels stay high. And we see a 3.9 times increased risk for them to experience a cardiovascular event within their lifetime. 3.9 times. And I've yet to see any valid criticism by these LDL deniers about Mendelian randomization studies. Of course, there's way more research behind the association or causality behind LDL levels and cardiovascular disease. And I personally feel like ApoB, for example, would be even a better marker than LDL. My main takeaway is here that we see arteriosclerosis or plaque development in the arteries of these people that have a high LDL level since birth in early adulthood. I don't know how you can overlook these studies, to be honest. The research behind these food items is just huge, and it's getting bigger and bigger every year. And so are the associations. What are your thoughts about this topic? Feel free to let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.